The October heat still clung to Austin like a stubborn memory, even though the calendar insisted fall had arrived. Governor Greg Abbott rolled his wheelchair through the marble halls of the Texas state capitol, the familiar squeak of the wheels echoing off the high ceilings. His chief of staff, Maria Gonzalez, walked briskly beside him, her heels clicking a steady rhythm on the polished floor. "Governor, the press conference is set for 2 o'clock, Maria said, glancing at her tablet. "Channel 8, Fox 7, and the Austin American-Statesman will be there. CNN's sending someone from Dallas, and I suspect we'll see some national pickup." Abbott's jaw tightened slightly. "Good. It's about time folks outside Texas understand what we're dealing with here." His voice carried that distinctive blend of authority and Texas drawl that had become his trademark over the years. "Any word from Lieutenant Governor Patrick?" "He'll be there, sir. Says he's got your back 100% on this." They passed beneath the rotunda, where tourists craned their necks to admire the star-studded dome above. Abbott had made this journey thousands of times since taking office, but today felt different. Today, he wasn't just defending policy, he was defending principle. The controversy had been brewing for weeks. Federal guidelines suggested that during the recent surge in respiratory illness cases, large gatherings should be limited, including religious services. Some other states had complied without question, not Texas. "Not on Abbott's watch, sir," Maria continued. "We've got reports that Reverend Johnson from First Baptist Houston is driving up for the conference. Word is he's bringing a delegation of pastors from across East Texas." Abbott nodded approvingly. "Good man, Johnson. He understands what's at stake here." He paused at his office door, turning his wheelchair to face Maria fully. "This isn't just about church services, Maria. This is about the soul of Texas. About whether we're gonna let Washington bureaucrats tell us how to worship the Almighty." "Hey, before we continue, let me ask you, have you liked and subscribed to the channel yet? No? Then take advantage now and click the subscribe button below, and leave a comment with what you think of this video and which city you're watching it from. Your participation is very important to us. It helps our channel grow and bring more content like this. I'm counting on you. Now, let's continue. Inside his office, the walls were lined with Texas memorabilia, photographs with past presidents, a Lone Star flag, and prominently displayed a framed copy of the Texas Constitution. Abbott positioned himself behind his desk. The afternoon sun streaming through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. His press secretary, Jake Morrison, knocked and entered without waiting for permission. A privilege earned through years of loyal service. "Governor, we've got about 30 minutes before showtime. You want to run through the talking points one more time?" "Jake, I've been thinking about this for longer than you know." Abbott's voice took on that measured tone he used when discussing matters close to his heart. "My daddy raised me in church every Sunday. Rain or shine, we were in those pews at Duncanville's First Methodist. That's where I learned right from wrong, where I learned to serve something bigger than myself." He wheeled himself to the window, looking out over the grounds where protesters had gathered, some supporting his stance, others opposing it. Signs reading faith over fear mingled with others declaring science saves lives. "You know what I see out there, Jake?" Abbott didn't wait for an answer. "I see the heart of democracy, people exercising their right to be heard. But I also see confusion, and that's on us to clear up." Jake pulled out his notepad. "What's your main message today, sir?" Abbott turned back to face him, his expression resolute. "That in Texas, we don't just protect the right to bear arms or the right to free speech. We protect the right to gather in God's house, to seek comfort in community, and to practice our faith without interference from government, whether that's Austin, Washington, or anywhere else." The phone on his desk buzzed. Maria's voice came through the intercom. "Governor, Reverend Johnson and his delegation have arrived." "Send Emin," Abbott replied. Straightening his tie, the door opened, and Reverend Charles Johnson entered, followed by 5 other men, pastors from across Texas, their faces showing the weight of leadership in challenging times. Johnson, a tall black man in his 60s with silver threading through his hair, had been a fixture in Houston's religious community for over 3 decades. "Governor Abbott," Johnson said, extending his hand. thank you for taking this stand. My congregation's been praying for wisdom for all our leaders." Abbott shook his hand firmly. "Reverend, your prayers are appreciated, and your support means everything. This fight isn't just political, it's spiritual." Pastor Miguel Rodriguez from San Antonio stepped forward. "Governor, my parishioners are scared. They're hearing mixed messages from the health department, from Washington, from their own families. They need to know their church will be there for them, and it will be," Abbott said with conviction. "That's exactly what we're gonna make clear today." As the pastors settled into chairs around Abbott's desk, the weight of the moment settled over the room. Outside, the October sun continued its relentless shine, but inside the Capitol, decisions were being made that would resonate far beyond Texas borders. The press room in the Texas state capitol buzzed with anticipation. Reporters adjusted their equipment while camera operators found the best angles. The podium stood ready, flanked by Texas and American flags, with the state seal prominently displayed behind it. Governor Abbott entered the room precisely at 2 o'clock, followed by Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and the delegation of pastors. The wheelchair ramp had been positioned perfectly, allowing Abbott to approach the podium with dignity and authority. The room fell silent as he positioned himself at the microphone. "Good afternoon, y'all," Abbott began, his voice carrying easily through the room. "I'm here today to address something that goes to the very heart of who we are as Texans and as Americans." He paused, scanning the crowd of reporters, noting the familiar faces and the newcomers from national outlets. For the past several weeks, there's been considerable discussion about the role of religious institutions during times of public health concern. Some have suggested that churches, synagogues, mosques, and other places of worship should be restricted or closed. Today, I'm here to explain why. In Texas, we've determined that religious services are essential services. A reporter from the Houston Chronicle raised her hand immediately, but Abbott continued without acknowledging her. "Before I take questions, let me be crystal clear about the foundation of this decision." Abbott's voice took on the cadence of a man who had thought deeply about his words. "The First Amendment to the United States Constitution, the very First Amendment, guarantees the free exercise of religion, not the free exercise when convenient, not the free exercise when government deems it appropriate. The free exercise, period." Reverend Johnson nodded approvingly from his seat in the front row. "But this goes beyond constitutional law," Abbott continued. "This goes to the practical reality of what churches mean to our communities. During Hurricane Harvey, who opened their doors first to provide shelter? Our churches. During the ice storm of 2021, who made sure elderly folks had warm meals and safe places to stay? Our churches, when families struggle with addiction, grief, financial hardship. Who's there 7 days a week, not just during business hours? Our churches." Abbott paused to take a sip of water, the room remaining respectfully silent. "I want to share something personal with y'all," he said, his voice softening slightly. 27 years ago, I was out for a jog when a tree fell and crushed my spine. Changed my life forever. In those dark days that followed, when I was learning to navigate a world that suddenly looked very different, it wasn't just doctors and physical therapists who got me through. It was my faith community. It was the folks at church who showed up at the hospital, who prayed with my family, who helped us understand that my purpose hadn't ended. It had just taken a different form." The emotion in his voice was unmistakable, and several reporters looked up from their notepads, recognizing the rare moment of personal vulnerability from the typically guarded governor. "That's what churches do," Abbott continued, his voice regaining its strength. "They don't just provide spiritual guidance on Sundays. They provide hope when hope is hard to find. They provide community when people feel isolated. They provide purpose when life doesn't make sense." Lieutenant Governor Patrick leaned forward slightly, knowing his cue was coming. "Now, some folks might say, Governor, surely people can worship at home. Surely they can watch services online. And you know what? They can, and many have. But faith isn't just about individual belief, it's about community. It's about the widow who finds comfort sitting next to the same family every Sunday. It's about the teenager who learns responsibility by helping with the children's ministry. It's about the businessman who discovers humility by serving meals at the church food bank. Abbott gestured toward the pastors seated in the front row. These men represent thousands of congregations across Texas. They serve communities urban and rural, rich and poor, of every ethnic and cultural background. They've seen firsthand what happens when people are cut off from their spiritual communities. Pastor Rodriguez stood briefly and nodded, then sat back down. Reverend Johnson here leads a congregation of over 3,000 families in Houston. Pastor Rodriguez serves a community in San Antonio, where many families have been in Texas for generations, and many others just arrived. Pastor Williams ministers to folks in East Texas who might drive 30 miles to get to church. Each of these men will tell you the same thing. Their people need their church, especially during difficult times. Abbott looked directly into the main camera. So when federal guidelines suggest that religious gatherings should be limited or eliminated, we have a responsibility to push back. Not because we don't care about public health, we do. Not because we don't take medical advice seriously, we do. But because we understand that spiritual health is part of overall health, and community is essential to human flourishing. The room was completely silent now, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning system. Churches aren't just buildings, Abbott said, his voice rising slightly. They're not just weekly social gatherings. They are essential services because they provide something that government cannot provide, something that no other institution can fully replace. They provide hope, purpose, community, and connection to something greater than ourselves. He paused, letting his words settle over the room. Questions? The first hand up belonged to Sarah Martinez from St. Austin. Abbott nodded in her direction. Governor, critics say you're putting politics ahead of public health. How do you respond to medical experts who argue that large gatherings, regardless of the setting, can contribute to the spread of disease? Abbott had anticipated this question. Sarah, that's exactly the kind of false choice that's been plaguing this entire discussion. Who says we have to choose between faith and health? Our churches have been incredibly responsible. They've implemented safety protocols. They've provided hand sanitizer. They've adjusted their practices. But closing them down entirely, that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. He gestured toward Reverend Johnson. Reverend, you want to speak to what your congregation's been doing? Johnson stood and approached the microphone. Thank you, Governor. At First Baptist Houston, we've been working closely with local health officials from day one. We've spaced out CD. Johnson stood and approached the microphone. Thank you, Governor. At First Baptist Houston, we've been working closely with local health officials from day one. We've spaced out seating. We've enhanced our cleaning protocols. We've offered multiple service times to reduce crowding. But what we haven't done is abandon our calling to serve our community. He paused, his deep voice carrying the authority of decades in ministry. Last month alone, our food pantry served over 500 families. Our counseling center helped 43 people deal with depression and anxiety. Our job placement ministry connected 19 folks with employment. You tell me how that's not essential. A reporter from the Dallas Morning News raised his hand. Governor, some argue that you're using religious freedom as a cover for partisan politics. What's your response? Abbott's expression hardened slightly. That question right there shows how far we've fallen from understanding what religious liberty means in America. This isn't partisan. This is foundational. When John Adams said our Constitution was designed for moral and religious people, he wasn't being partisan. When Sam Houston carried a Bible with him during the fight for Texas independence, he wasn't being partisan. When we put in God we trust on our money, that wasn't partisan. Lieutenant Governor Patrick nodded approvingly. As Abbott continued, the suggestion that defending religious freedom is somehow political shows how much we've lost sight of our core values. This isn't about Republican or Democrat. This is about American. This is about Texan. A woman from CNN raised her hand. Governor, other governors have made different decisions about religious gatherings. Are you saying they're wrong? I'm saying they have to answer to their constituents. And I have to answer to mine, Abbott replied diplomatically. But I will say this, Texas has always been different. We've always believed that individual liberty and personal responsibility go hand in hand. We trust our people to make good decisions for themselves and their families. Pastor Williams from East Texas stood up without being called upon. If I may, Governor, Abbott nodded, and Williams approached the microphone. He was a smaller man, probably in his 70s, with weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work before entering ministry. I serve 3 rural congregations, Williams said, his accent thick with East Texas timber country roots. The nearest hospital is 45 minutes away. The nearest mental health facility is 2 hours. But every Sunday, every Wednesday, every time someone's in crisis, the church is there. We've buried more folks in the past year than any of us care to remember. We've celebrated births, marriages, high school graduations. We've helped families keep their farms when the bank wanted to foreclose. His voice cracked slightly with emotion. You close the churches, and you're not just closing a building. You're tearing the heart out of communities that have been woven together by faith for generations. The room was completely silent. Even the reporters seemed moved by the old pastor's words. Abbott wheeled closer to the microphone. That's exactly what I'm talking about. In rural Texas, in urban Texas, in suburban Texas, churches aren't just part of the community. They are the community. They're where people go when they're hurting, when they're celebrating, when they need to remember that they're part of something bigger than themselves. A reporter from the Austin American-Statesman raised her hand. Governor, what about separation of church and state? Some argue that declaring church as essential services blurs that line. Abbott smiled slightly, the question he'd been waiting for. That's exactly backwards. Separation of church and state means the government can't establish a religion and can't prohibit the free exercise of religion. Declaring church as essential services isn't the government endorsing religion. It's the government recognizing that it has no business interfering with religion. He leaned forward slightly in his wheelchair. The founders didn't create separation of church and state to protect government from religion. They created it to protect religion from government. There's a big difference. Lieutenant Governor Patrick stepped to a second microphone. If I may add something, Governor, Abbott nodded. The question assumes that government gets to decide what's essential and what's not, Patrick said. But who made government the arbiter of human need? When a family loses a child, is their need for spiritual comfort less essential than their need for groceries? When someone's struggling with addiction, is their need for a faith community less essential than their need for entertainment? Pastor Rodriguez returned to the microphone. In San Antonio, we've got congregations that have been meeting for over 100 years. They've survived wars, depressions, pandemics, natural disasters. They've survived because they serve a need. That doesn't go away when times get tough. It gets stronger. Abbott nodded thoughtfully. That's the point exactly. Essential services aren't just about physical needs. They're about human needs, and human beings need community, purpose, hope, and connection to something greater than themselves. Churches provide that. That's why they're essential. The press conference was reaching its natural conclusion, but Abbott had one more point to make. Let me leave y'all with this thought, he said, his voice taking on the tone of a man speaking from deep conviction. Texas became Texas because people were willing to fight for their principles. We didn't become the great state we are today by letting other folks tell us how to live, how to worship, or how to govern ourselves. We're not gonna start now. The room erupted in questions, but Abbott raised his hand for silence. That's all for today, folks. Thank you. As he wheeled away from the podium, followed by the delegation of pastors, the reporters were already reaching for their phones, knowing they had just witnessed something that would resonate far beyond the walls of the Texas state capitol. The drive from Austin to Houston took Abbott through the heart of Texas, rolling hills giving way to pine forests, then stretching into the vast coastal plains. He'd made this journey countless times, but today felt different. The press conference had ended 3 hours earlier, and already his phone was buzzing with calls from supporters and critics alike. Maria sat in the passenger seat of the state vehicle, fielding calls and monitoring social media. Governor, we're already trending on Twitter. Hashtag churches are essential is picking up steam. But so is hashtag Abbott overreach. Abbott stared out the window at the familiar landscape. That's democracy, Maria. Messy, loud, and beautiful. They were heading to Houston for an evening town hall at Reverend Johnson's church. A decision made quickly after the press conference to capitalize on the momentum. Abbott knew that if he was going to make this case stick, he needed to take it directly to the people. "Sir," Maria continued, scrolling through her tablet, "we've got Governor DeSantis from Florida calling the press conference brilliant leadership. Governor Newsom from California says you're recklessly endangering public health. Pretty much what we expected." The governor's security detail maintained their professional distance in the vehicle behind them. But Abbott could feel the weight of increased attention when you take a stand on principle. He thought, everybody wants to know what you're really made of. His phone rang, a number he recognized immediately. "Well, hello there, Barbara," he answered, his voice warming considerably. Barbara Abbott, his wife of over 2 decades, knew her husband's voice better than anyone. "Greg, I just watched the press conference. You look tired. Long day, honey. But a good day, I know that tone," she said with the gentle authority of a woman who'd stood by her man through the highest highs and lowest lows of political life. "You're second-guessing yourself." Abbott smiled slightly. Even after all these years, she could read him like a book, not second-guessing, just thinking about what comes next. What comes next is what always comes next when you do the right thing, Barbara said firmly. "Some folks'll love you for it, some folks'll hate you for it, and the rest will eventually come around to understanding why you did it." They passed a small church in a town called Burton, its white steeple reaching toward the darkening sky. A simple sign out front read, "God loves you. Come as you are." "Barbara, you remember when we first started dating, and I told you I wanted to get into politics to make a difference? I remember you were young and idealistic and thought you could change the world." She laughed softly. "Still think that. After all these years, I think the world changes us as much as we change it." Abbott replied thoughtfully, "But I also think that's exactly why we need places like churches. They remind us who we're supposed to be." As they entered the outskirts of Houston, the landscape transformed from rural to suburban, then to the sprawling urban center that was home to over 2 million people. Abbott had always marveled at Texas's diversity, from the East Texas pine forests to the hill country, from border towns to major metropolitan areas. Each region had its own character, but they all shared something fundamental. "Maria, what's the latest from Reverend Johnson's church?" "They're expecting about 800 people tonight, sir. Local media will be there, and I suspect some national crews as well. The church has set up overflow seating in their fellowship hall." Abbott nodded. 800 people on a Wednesday night. That told him something about how deeply this issue resonated with ordinary Texans. They pulled into the parking lot of First Baptist Houston just as the sun was setting. The church was impressive, a modern building that could seat several thousand, with beautiful landscaping and a distinctive bell tower. But what caught Abbott's attention were the people streaming in through the doors, families with children, elderly couples walking slowly but determinedly, young professionals still in their work clothes, construction workers with dirt still on their boots. Reverend Johnson met them at the side entrance, his face showing both excitement and the weight of responsibility. "Governor, thank you for coming. My people are eager to hear from you. Reverend, thank you for opening your doors. This is exactly where this conversation needs to happen. Not in the Capitol building, but in the heart of the community." As they walked through the church corridors, Abbott noticed the walls lined with photographs, mission trips to Guatemala, volunteer work after Hurricane Harvey, youth group activities, senior citizen programs. This wasn't just a Sunday morning operation. This was a 7-day-a-week community anchor, Governor Johnson said as they approached the sanctuary. "I want you to know that not everyone here tonight agrees with your position. We've got folks who are worried about health risks, folks who think maybe we should be more cautious, but they're here because they want to understand." Abbott smiled. "Reverend, if everyone already agreed with me, we wouldn't need to have this conversation." The sanctuary was indeed packed, with every pew filled and people standing along the walls. The demographic was exactly what Abbott had hoped to see. Not just the usual political crowd, but real families, working people, folks who rarely attended political events but cared deeply about their community. Johnson stepped to the pulpit microphone. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out on a Wednesday night. As you know, we've invited Governor Abbott to speak with us about his decision regarding churches and essential services. This is not a political rally. This is a community conversation. We're here to listen, to learn, and to understand each other better. The crowd settled into respectful silence as Abbott wheeled himself to the front of the sanctuary. He looked out over the faces, black and white and Hispanic, young and old, well-dressed and work-worn. This was Texas in all its complex glory. Good evening, folks. Abbott began, his voice carrying easily through the sanctuary without amplification. I want to thank Reverend Johnson and First Baptist Houston for hosting us tonight. I also want to thank y'all for taking time out of your busy lives to be here. He paused, scanning the crowd. I'm not here tonight as a politician trying to win votes. I'm here as a fellow Texan, a fellow person of faith, trying to explain a decision that I believe goes to the heart of who we are as a people. A baby cried somewhere in the back, and Abbott smiled. That's all right, little one. Even the youngest Texans have a right to be heard. The crowd chuckled, and Abbott could feel the tension in the room begin to ease. Before I share my thoughts, Abbott continued, I want to hear from y'all. This decision affects your lives, your families, your community. So let's start there. A middle-aged Hispanic woman in the third pew raised her hand. Abbott nodded to her. Governor, my name is Carmen Rodriguez. I work as a nurse at Methodist Hospital, and I've seen firsthand how serious this health situation is. I love my church, but I'm scared. How do we balance our faith with keeping people safe? Abbott appreciated the honest, direct question. Carmen, first of all, thank you for your service as a nurse. Healthcare workers like you are heroes. The congregation murmured agreement. Your question gets to the heart of this whole issue. I don't think we have to choose between faith and safety. I think we can have both. He wheeled himself closer to the congregation. Churches across Texas have shown incredible creativity and responsibility. They've implemented safety protocols. They've offered multiple services to reduce crowding. They've provided online options for folks who prefer to stay home. But what they haven't done is abandon their mission to serve their communities. An elderly black gentleman near the front raised his hand. Governor, I'm James Washington. I'm 82 years old, and I've been coming to this church for 43 years. My question is simple. Who's gonna take care of the lonely old folks if you close the churches? Abbott's expression grew serious. Mr. Washington, that's exactly the question that keeps me up at night. Government programs can provide services, but they can't provide what churches provide. Genuine community, personal connection, spiritual comfort. A young mother with 2 small children raised her hand. Governor, I'm Sarah Mitchell. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm a single mom working 2 jobs. I barely have time to bring my kids to church on Sunday as it is. Why not just encourage people to worship at home and avoid the whole controversy? Abbott nodded thoughtfully. Sarah, I hear you, and I know how hard you're working to provide for your children. But let me ask you this, when you bring your kids to church, what do they get that they don't get at home? Sarah considered the question. Well, they see other families. They learn from their Sunday school teachers. They understand they're part of something bigger than just our little family. Exactly, Abbott said. And that's something that can't be replaced by watching services on TV or computer. Community isn't just about convenience, it's about connection. Reverend Johnson stepped forward. Governor, if I may, I'd like to share something with the congregation. Abbott gestured for him to continue. Last month, we had a family in our church lose their teenage son in a car accident. Within 2 hours of getting the news, over 50 families from this congregation had shown up at their home. They brought food, they helped with arrangements. They just sat with the family and grieved with them. You can't do that over the internet. You can't do that through government programs. That's what the church provides, a man in work clothes. Near the back called out without raising his hand. But Reverend, what if gathering like this makes people sick? What if someone dies because they came to church? The sanctuary fell silent. It was the question everyone was thinking, but few were willing to voice. Abbott decided to address it head-on. Sir, that's a fair and important question. Let me be clear, every decision in life involves risk. Getting in your car to drive here tonight involved risk. Going to work tomorrow involves risk. The question isn't whether we can eliminate all risk. We can't. The question is whether the benefit justifies the risk. He paused, choosing his words carefully. For some people, the risk may be too high, and they should stay home. For others, the spiritual and emotional cost of isolation may be the greater danger. That's why we trust individuals and families to make the right decision for their circumstances. A teenage girl in the youth section raised her hand. "Governor, I'm Ashley Chen. I'm 17. And honestly, a lot of my friends think religion is outdated anyway. Why should government protect something that fewer and fewer people care about?" Abbott smiled at her directness. "Ashley, that's a great question, and I appreciate your honesty. You know what? The Founding Fathers probably could have asked the same question. When they were writing the Constitution, there were plenty of people who thought religion was becoming less important." He leaned forward in his wheelchair. "But they protected religious freedom anyway, not because religion was popular, but because they understood that freedom isn't about protecting popular ideas. It's about protecting the right to believe differently, to find meaning in different ways, to build community around shared values." Ashley nodded, seeming to consider this. An older white man near the middle of the sanctuary raised his hand. "Governor, I'm Tom Bradley. I've lived in Houston my whole life, and I've seen this city change a lot. We've got people here from all over the world with different religions, different cultures. When you talk about protecting churches, are you talking about protecting all faiths, or just Christian churches?" Abbott's response was immediate and firm. "Mr. Bradley, when I talk about religious freedom, I mean religious freedom for everyone. Churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, all of them. The First Amendment doesn't say Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of Christianity. It says religion, period." He gestured broadly. "Texas is home to people of every faith tradition, and every one of them deserves the same protection. That's what makes America great. Not that we all believe the same thing, but that we all have the right to believe." Carmen Rodriguez, the nurse who had asked the first question, raised her hand again. "Governor, I appreciate what you're saying about balance, but can you be more specific? What safety measures are you requiring churches to implement?" "Carmen, that's where local flexibility comes in," Abbott replied. "Rather than mandate specific measures from Austin, we're encouraging churches to work with their local health departments to develop appropriate protocols. Some churches might space out seating, others might offer more services with smaller numbers, others might focus on outdoor worship when weather permits." Reverend Johnson nodded. "If I may, Governor, I'd like to share what we're doing here at First Baptist Houston." Abbott gestured for him to continue. "We've implemented several measures," Johnson explained to the congregation. "We've enhanced our cleaning protocols. We're providing hand sanitizer at every entrance. We've created more space between families in the pews, and we've added 2 additional services on Sunday morning to reduce crowding. We've also continued our online streaming for folks who prefer to worship from home." He paused, looking around the sanctuary. "But most importantly, we've emphasized personal responsibility. We've asked folks to use their best judgment. If you're feeling unwell, stay home. If you're in a high-risk category, consider our online options. If you're comfortable being here, we're glad to have you." As the evening progressed, Abbott found himself energized by the genuine nature of the questions and the respectful tone of the discussion. This wasn't a political rally or a staged event. This was democracy in action. People wrestling with real questions that affected their daily lives. A middle-aged man in a business suit raised his hand. "Governor, I'm David Park. I own a small business here in Houston, and I've had to lay off half my employees because of various restrictions. I'm not against churches staying open, but it seems unfair that some businesses have been forced to close while churches get special treatment." Abbott nodded seriously. "David, you've raised one of the most important questions of this entire discussion, and I appreciate your perspective as a business owner. You're absolutely right that we need to be consistent and fair." He shifted in his wheelchair, addressing not just David, but the entire congregation. "The difference between churches and most businesses isn't about favoritism. It's about the nature of the service they provide. A restaurant provides food, which is important. A gym provides fitness opportunities, which is valuable. But churches provide something unique. They address the spiritual needs of human beings. Abbott's voice grew more passionate. When someone loses their job, like the employees you had to lay off, David, where do they often turn for help? Not just financial help, but emotional support, spiritual guidance, hope for the future. They turned to their faith community. An elderly woman near the front nodded vigorously. Now, I'm not saying churches are more important than businesses, Abbott continued. I'm saying they serve a different kind of essential need. And in times of crisis, that need becomes even more crucial. David seemed to consider this. I understand that, Governor, but my employees have families to feed. That's pretty essential too. You're absolutely right, David. And that's exactly why we've been working to safely reopen businesses as quickly as possible, while maintaining appropriate precautions. But closing churches doesn't help your employees. It just eliminates one more source of support they might need during difficult times. A young man in the back called out, Governor, what about the argument that you're just playing politics? That you're taking this stand because it helps you with conservative voters? The directness of the question caused a slight stir in the congregation, but Abbott welcomed it. Son, what's your name? Marcus Johnson. I'm Reverend Johnson's nephew. Abbott smiled. Well, Marcus, family gatherings must be interesting at the Johnson house. The congregation chuckled. That's a fair question, and I appreciate you asking it directly. He became more serious. Here's the truth. Taking controversial stands doesn't help politicians, it hurts them. It would be much easier for me to avoid this issue entirely, to let other people make the hard decisions and deal with the consequences. Abbott paused, his voice taking on a more personal tone. But leadership isn't about taking the easy path. It's about doing what you believe is right, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult. He looked around the sanctuary. I didn't decide to defend religious freedom because it was politically convenient. I decided to defend it because I believe it's fundamental to who we are as Americans and as Texans. Marcus nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer. An older Hispanic gentleman raised his hand. Governor, I'm Roberto Castillo. My family came to Texas from Mexico 3 generations ago. We've always been grateful for the freedom we found here. But some people say that emphasizing Christian values excludes people like us, who might not be part of the dominant culture. Abbott's response was immediate and heartfelt. Mr. Castillo, religious freedom includes everyone. The same constitutional principles that protect Baptist churches protect Catholic churches, Jewish synagogues, Muslim mosques, and every other faith tradition. He wheeled himself closer to Mr. Castillo. When I defend the right of churches to remain open, I'm defending the right of every faith community to gather, to worship, to serve their members and their broader community. That's not exclusion, that's inclusion. Reverend Johnson stepped forward again, if I may. Governor, I think it's important for our congregation to understand the broader implications of this decision. Abbott nodded for him to continue. What the governor is defending isn't just about Sunday morning worship services, Johnson explained. Our church runs a food pantry that serves 500 families a month. We have a counseling center that provides free mental health services. We operate a job training program. We provide emergency financial assistance. We run a senior citizen day program. He gestured broadly. All of these services depend on our ability to gather, to organize, to function as a community. When you restrict church gatherings, you're not just affecting worship, you're affecting all the ways churches serve their communities. A young professional woman raised her hand. I'm Jennifer Adams. I work downtown. And I have to admit, I don't go to church very often, but I see the homeless shelter that several churches run together. I see the after-school programs. I see the disaster relief efforts. I guess I never thought about how all of that connects to Sunday morning services. Abbott seized on her observation. Jennifer, that's exactly the point. Churches aren't just Sunday morning operations. They're 7-day-a-week community institutions. The worship services are what bring people together and give them the shared purpose. That makes all the other ministry possible. An elderly man with a walker raised his hand. Governor, I'm Bill Richardson. I'm 91 years old, and I've lived through a lot of crises. I remember when churches were about the only social safety net we had. I worry that people today don't understand how important that is. Abbott's voice softened with respect. Mr. Richardson, thank you for your perspective. You've seen things that many of us have only read about in history books. What would you want younger people to understand about the role of churches in community? The old man's voice was weak but clear. I'd want them to understand that government programs come and go. Politicians come and go. But churches have been here through everything. The Depression, to world wars, hurricanes, economic crashes. They're still here because they're not just institutions, they're families. The sanctuary was completely quiet as his words sank in. Abbott nodded slowly. Mr. Richardson, I think you've just explained better than I ever could why churches are essential services. They're not essential because government says they are. They're essential because communities depend on them, because families depend on them, because individuals depend on them. As the evening drew toward a close, Abbott looked around the packed sanctuary one more time. Folks, I want to thank y'all for this conversation. You've asked hard questions, you've shared honest concerns, and you've reminded me why I believe so strongly in this decision. He paused, his voice taking on the cadence of a man speaking from deep conviction. Texas has always been a place where people could pursue their dreams, practice their faith, and build the kind of communities they wanted to live in. That's not going to change on my watch. The congregation erupted in sustained applause, but Abbott raised his hand for quiet. Before we close, I want to say one more thing. This isn't about me, and it's not about any politician. This is about principles that are bigger than any of us. This is about freedom, community, and the right of people to gather in fellowship with one another. He looked directly into the faces before him. Y'all are the reason these principles matter. Thank you for reminding me of that tonight. As the applause continued, Abbott knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he had made the right decision. The faces looking back at him weren't just constituents. They were neighbors, friends, fellow Texans who understood that some things are worth defending, even when the defense isn't easy. 3 weeks after the Houston town hall, Abbott sat in his Austin office reviewing reports from across Texas. The decision to declare churches essential services had created waves that extended far beyond what anyone had anticipated. Maria entered with her usual stack of briefings, but her expression suggested this wasn't routine business. Governor, we need to talk about what's happening in East Texas, she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. Abbott looked up from the reports. What kind of what's happening? Pastor Williams, you remember him from the press conference. He's been getting death threats. Apparently, some folks think he influenced your decision too much. Others are angry that churches in his area aren't implementing enough safety measures. Abbott's jaw tightened. How serious are the threats? Serious enough that the local sheriff has offered him protection. But here's the thing. Governor, Pastor Williams says he doesn't want security. Says it would send the wrong message to his congregation. The weight of leadership pressed down on Abbott's shoulders like a familiar burden. Every decision created consequences, and consequences affected real people with real lives. Get me Sheriff Martinez on the phone. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with. While Maria made the call, Abbott wheeled himself to the window overlooking the Capitol grounds. Protesters had become a daily fixture, some supporting his stance, others opposing it. Democracy in action, he reminded himself, but that didn't make it easier when good people got caught in the crossfire. Governor, Maria said. Hanging up the phone, Sheriff Martinez says the threats seem to be coming from outside the area. Folks who don't even know Pastor Williams, but are angry about the church issue in general. Abbott turned back to his desk. And what about the other side of this? Any churches pushing back against safety protocols? Maria consulted her notes. Actually, that's been the surprising part. Most churches have been incredibly responsible, but there are a few, maybe 3 or 4 statewide, that are interpreting your declaration as permission to ignore all precautions. This was exactly what Abbott had worried about. When you take a principled stand, some people try to use it as cover for irresponsible behavior. Get me a meeting with the Texas Council of Churches, We need to address this before it gets out of hand. His phone buzzed with a call from Lieutenant Governor Patrick. Dan, good timing. Maria was just briefing me on some complications. Greg, I've been hearing the same things. Patrick's voice came through the speaker. But I've also been hearing something else that might interest you. Word is that Governor Reynolds in Iowa is considering similar language about churches. And there's talk that Florida might be next. Abbott leaned back in his wheelchair. This thing's got legs, doesn't it? More than legs, Greg. This might be becoming a national movement. Question is, are you ready to be the face of it? Before Abbott could answer, Maria was waving urgently from her desk, pointing to the television mounted on the wall. Abbott grabbed the remote and turned up the volume. In what appears to be a coordinated response to Texas Governor Greg Abbott's controversial declaration, the CNN anchor was saying, governors in 3 states have now issued similar orders, protecting religious gatherings. Meanwhile, civil liberties groups are preparing legal challenges, arguing that. Abbott muted the television and looked at Patrick through the phone. Dan, I think that question just answered itself. The next morning brought a conference call that Abbott had been both expecting and dreading. On the line were governors from Iowa, Florida, South Dakota, and Tennessee, all asking for his guidance on implementing similar policies. Greg, came the voice of Governor Reynolds from Iowa. We've been watching what you've done in Texas, and frankly, we're impressed. But we're also learning from your experience. What would you do differently if you had to start over? Abbott considered the question carefully. Kim, the most important thing is to get the religious community involved from the beginning. Don't just declare churches essential. Work with them to define what that means practically. Governor DeSantis from Florida chimed in. What about the pushback from health officials? We're hearing that some of your state health department folks weren't exactly thrilled. Ron, that's where clear communication becomes crucial, Abbott replied. We weren't dismissing health concerns. We were balancing them against other equally important concerns. The key is showing that you've thought it through, not just made an emotional decision. Governor Noem from South Dakota asked, Greg, what about the legal challenges? Our Attorney General is worried about constitutional issues. Abbott smiled slightly. Christie, I spent 12 years as Attorney General before becoming governor. The Constitution is on our side here. The First Amendment doesn't say religious freedom is subject to government approval. It says government can't prohibit the free exercise of religion. As the call continued, Abbott realized that his decision had indeed sparked something larger than just a Texas policy. This was becoming a national conversation about the role of faith in American life, about the balance between government authority and individual liberty, about what it means to be essential in times of crisis. After the call ended, Abbott found himself thinking about Pastor Williams and the threats he was receiving. Leadership meant accepting responsibility not just for the immediate consequences of decisions, but for all the ways those decisions rippled out into the world. He called Maria into his office. I want to visit Pastor Williams this weekend. No media, no fanfare, just a governor checking on one of his constituents. Maria nodded. I'll arrange security and transportation. And Maria, make sure Pastor Williams knows this isn't a photo op. This is just neighbors looking out for each other. The drive to East Texas took Abbott through some of the most beautiful countryside in the state. Towering pine trees lined the highways, their green canopy providing welcome shade from the October sun. Small towns dotted the landscape, each with its own character but all sharing that distinctive East Texas charm that came from generations of families who had worked the land and built communities around shared values. Pastor Williams's church sat on a hill overlooking the town of Marshall, a simple white building with a modest steeple and a hand-painted sign. That read Pine Grove Baptist Church, established 1887. The parking lot was gravel, and the lawn showed the loving care of volunteers who took pride in their place of worship habits. Security detail had arrived earlier and positioned themselves discreetly around the property. This wasn't about political theater. This was about ensuring that a good man could continue serving his community without fear. Pastor Williams emerged from the church as Abbott's vehicle pulled up. He was a small man, probably in his mid-70s. with hands that showed a lifetime of hard work and eyes that reflected both wisdom and weariness. He approached Abbott's wheelchair with the quiet dignity that had impressed everyone at the Capitol press conference. "Governor Abbott, this is quite an honor," Williams said, his East Texas accent thick as pine sap, "though I have to say, I never expected to have the governor of Texas visiting our little church." Abbott shook his hand warmly. "Pastor Williams, after what you've been through because of my decision, it's the least I can do." "How are you holding up?" Williams gestured toward the church. "Come on inside, Governor. Let's sit a spell and talk." The interior of Pine Grove Baptist was exactly what Abbott had expected. Worn wooden pews that had been polished by generations of worshipers, simple stained glass windows that cast colored light across the sanctuary, and an atmosphere of quiet reverence that spoke of decades of faithful service. They settled in the front pew, Abbott positioning his wheelchair beside Williams. For a moment, neither man spoke, both feeling the weight of the sanctuary's history. "Pastor, I need you to know that I never intended for you to become a target," Abbott began. "When I made that decision about churches being essential services, I was thinking about principles, about constitutional rights. I wasn't thinking about the personal cost to folks like you." Williams smiled gently. "Governor, I've been in ministry for 43 years. I've learned that doing the right thing usually comes with a cost. The question isn't whether you'll pay a price. The question is whether the cause is worth it." He gestured around the sanctuary. "This little church has been here for over 130 years. We've survived the Great Depression, to world wars, the Civil Rights era, economic crashes, hurricanes, and more personal tragedies than I can count. You think a few angry phone calls are going to shut us down?" Abbott found himself moved by the old pastor's quiet strength. "Pastor, help me understand something. When you spoke at that press conference, when you talked about what churches mean to rural communities, were you speaking from experience?" Williams's expression grew thoughtful. "Governor, let me tell you about last month. We had a family in our congregation lose their farm to the bank. 3 generations of work gone. The father was talking about, well, let's just say he was in a dark place." The pastor paused, his voice becoming softer. "It wasn't a government program that pulled him back from the edge. It wasn't a politician or a bureaucrat. It was this congregation, folks who barely had enough themselves, but who showed up at his house every day for 2 weeks. They brought food. They helped with the kids. They just sat with him and reminded him that his life had value beyond what the bank statement said." Abbott listened intently as Williams continued. "That man's working now at Henderson's lumber yard. His kids are back in school. His wife's got hope in her eyes again. All because a community of faith decided that no one should face their darkest hour alone." The old pastor stood and walked to the simple wooden pulpit. "Governor, when you declared churches essential services, you weren't just making a political statement. You were recognizing something that government can't provide and can't replace: the power of people coming together in faith to care for each other." Abbott wheeled himself closer to the pulpit. "Pastor, what do you say to people who argue that churches could provide that same care?" While meeting virtually, Williams smiled. "Governor, you ever try to hug someone through a computer screen? You ever try to hold a crying child through a video call? You ever try to serve communion over the internet?" He gestured to the worn wooden pews. "Faith isn't just about believing something. It's about belonging somewhere. It's about knowing that when you walk through those doors, you're home." They spent the next hour walking through the church building, the small Sunday school rooms where children learned Bible stories, the fellowship hall where community meals were served, the pastor's office where countless counseling sessions had taken place. Each room told a story of lives touched, communities served, hope restored. As they prepared to leave, Williams placed his hand on Abbott's shoulder. "Governor, I want you to know that whatever criticism you face for this decision, you've got the prayers of a lot of folks who understand what you were defending." Abbott looked back at the simple church building. "Pastor, I've got to ask, are you afraid? The threats, the anger, the attention." Williams considered the question carefully. "Governor, I'm 74 years old. I've buried 3 wives, raised for children, and pastored this congregation through more crises than I can remember. What I've learned is that fear is a luxury we can't afford when we're called to serve others. He smiled. Besides, the same God who's watched over this little church for 130 years isn't going to abandon us now. As Abbott's convoy pulled away from Pine Grove Baptist Church, he found himself thinking about the difference between political leadership and moral leadership. Political leadership was about managing public opinion, building coalitions, winning elections. Moral leadership was about standing for principles even when, especially, when it cost you something. Looking back at Pastor Williams, who stood in front of his church waving goodbye, Abbott understood that he had encountered the second kind. 6 months later, Abbott sat in his office reviewing a stack of reports that would have seemed impossible when he first made his decision about churches. The legal challenges had been resolved in Texas's favor. 3 federal courts had upheld the essential services designation. Most importantly, churches across Texas had demonstrated remarkable responsibility while maintaining their vital community. Maria entered with her final briefing of the day. "Governor, I thought you'd want to see these numbers before tomorrow's interview." Abbott looked at the documents she handed him. "What am I looking at?" "Impact statistics from the Texas Council of Churches. Since your declaration, church-based food pantries have increased their service by 37%. Church-sponsored job training programs have placed over 2,000 people in employment. Emergency assistance programs have helped over 15,000 families avoid eviction or utility shutoffs." Abbott studied the numbers. "And health impacts, that's the remarkable part," Maria continued. "Churches that remained open actually showed lower transmission rates than the general population. Turns out that when you trust people to be responsible, they usually are." A knock at the door interrupted them. Jake Morrison, Abbott's press secretary, entered with a familiar expression that meant national media attention. "Governor, I just got off the phone with 60 Minutes. They want to do a segment on the church decision and its national impact. Apparently, 18 states have now adopted similar policies." Abbott leaned back in his wheelchair. When he had made the decision to declare churches essential services, he had been thinking about Texas, about his constituents, about doing what he believed was right. He hadn't anticipated becoming the face of a national movement. "Jake, what's the angle they're looking for?" "They want to explore whether you've changed the conversation about religious freedom in America. Specifically, they're interested in the idea that essential services aren't just about physical needs. They're about human needs." Abbott nodded thoughtfully. "Set it up. But I want them to interview Pastor Williams too, and Reverend Johnson, and some of the families who've been helped by church programs. This isn't about me. It's about the communities these churches serve." That evening, Abbott found himself at another church, this time St. David's Episcopal in Austin, where he and Barbara were attending a wedding. As he watched the young couple exchange vows surrounded by their faith community, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The bride's grandmother, elderly and frail, was helped to her feet by fellow parishioners to get a better view. The groom's young nephew, fidgeting in his suit, was quietly entertained by the woman sitting next to him. After the ceremony, Abbott watched as the congregation naturally formed a receiving line, each person offering congratulations, blessing, and support to the new family. This was what he had been defending, Abbott realized. Not just the right to attend Sunday services, but the right to be part of a community that celebrated your joys and supported you through your sorrows. The right to belong to something larger than yourself. Barbara squeezed his hand as they watched the celebration. "You look thoughtful tonight." "Just thinking about communities," Abbott replied. "About what holds them together. Any regrets about the whole church's decision?" Abbott considered the question. The death threats against Pastor Williams had been real. The political criticism had been intense. The legal challenges had been stressful. But looking around at the wedding celebration, at families spanning generations sharing in a moment of joy, he knew his answer. None. He said simply. 2 weeks later, Abbott found himself back where the journey had begun, at the Texas State Capitol, but this time for a very different kind of press conference. Joining him were Pastor Williams, Reverend Johnson, and representatives from churches across Texas, along with families who had been helped by church programs during the past months. 6 months ago, Abbott began, I made a decision that sparked considerable debate. Today, I want to share what we've learned from that decision. He gestured to the families standing behind him. These folks represent thousands of Texans who have been served by church communities. During one of the most challenging periods in recent memory, they've received food assistance, job training, counseling services, emergency financial help, and most importantly, the support of caring communities. Maria Rodriguez, the nurse from the Houston Town Hall, stepped forward. Governor, I was one of the people who questioned your decision 6 months ago. I was worried about health risks, but I want to tell you what I've seen since then. She looked directly into the cameras. My church didn't just stay open for Sunday services. They created a network that checked on elderly members daily, delivered groceries to families in quarantine, and provided emotional support to healthcare workers like me who were dealing with incredible stress. They saved lives in ways that had nothing to do with medicine. James Washington, the 82-year-old from Houston, spoke next. I told the governor 6 months ago that lonely old folks need their church. What I didn't mention was that I was one of those lonely old folks. Since then, my church family has become my lifeline. They've driven me to doctor appointments, helped me with grocery shopping, and most importantly, reminded me that I still matter. Abbott watched his story after story unfolded. Families kept in their homes, individuals pulled back from despair, communities strengthened through service to others. This was the real impact of his decision, not the political rhetoric or constitutional arguments, but changed lives and strengthened communities. Pastor Williams approached the microphone for the final statement. Governor Abbott asked me to speak today not about politics, but about what we've learned these past 6 months. The old pastor's voice carried easily through the press room. We've learned that when you trust people to do the right thing, they usually do. We've learned that communities of faith don't just serve their own members, they serve anyone in need. And we've learned that some things really are essential, not because government declares them so, but because human beings can't flourish without them. He paused, looking around the room. 6 months ago, there was a lot of fear about what might happen if churches remained open. Today, we have facts. Churches stayed open. Communities were served, and Texas is stronger because of it. As the press conference ended and the participants began to leave, Abbott found himself approached by a young reporter he didn't recognize. Governor, I'm Sarah Martinez from the Texas Tribune. I wanted to ask you something off the record. Abbott nodded for her to continue. Do you think this decision will define your legacy as governor? Abbott considered the question as he watched Pastor Williams say goodbye to the families he had helped, as he observed Reverend Johnson making plans for future community service projects, as he saw Maria Rodriguez hugging elderly Mr. Washington. Sarah, he said finally, I hope my legacy isn't defined by any single decision, but if it is, I hope it's defined by the decision to trust communities to take care of each other, to defend the rights that make us who we are, and to remember that government serves people, not the other way around. As Abbott wheeled himself out of the Capitol building and into the Texas sunshine, he felt the satisfaction that comes from knowing you've done the right thing for the right reasons. The political battles would continue, the debates would evolve, but the communities strengthened by his decision would endure. In Texas, churches would remain essential services not because a governor had declared them so, but because the people they served had proven they truly were.